March 22, 1945. The Rhine River, Germany's last natural defensive barrier. A liquid fortress that had protected the German heartland for centuries, its dark waters flowing swift and cold through the dying Reich. Allied planners estimated it would take weeks of preparation, thousands of casualties, and massive artillery support to force a crossing. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had been planning his elaborate Rhine crossing for months. Operation Plunder, the largest amphibious operation since D-Day, was scheduled for March 24th. 25 divisions, 37,000 vehicles, enough supplies to fill multiple freight trains. Montgomery, meticulous to a fault, was leaving nothing to chance. Then George S. Patton did the impossible. In less than 24 hours, without fanfare, without the massive buildup, without even informing Supreme Headquarters, Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim. Canvas boats and sheer audacity against a river the German General Staff swore was impassable. When word reached Winston Churchill in London, the Prime Minister's reaction was not what anyone expected. What he said in that moment would reveal everything about leadership, rivalry, and the brutal mathematics of war. This is the story of how one general's audacity changed the endgame of World War II, and what the most powerful man in Britain said when he learned about it. Before we begin, subscribe now and never miss these untold stories from history. Drop a comment below telling us what fascinates you most about Patton's Rhine crossing, or simply let us know where in the world you're watching from. The war in Europe was entering its final act, but the Rhine remained unconquered. And in the race to cross it first, two very different philosophies of warfare were about to collide. By March 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final act, but the Rhine remained unconquered. Hitler had declared it would be Germany's moat, ordering every bridge destroyed, every crossing point fortified. The river itself was a formidable obstacle, nearly 1,500 feet wide at many points, with currents reaching 6 knots, cold enough to kill a man in minutes. Its eastern bank rose in places to commanding heights, perfect defensive terrain for a Wehrmacht that had learned the bitter lessons of retreat. Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had approved Montgomery's Operation Plunder, a massive set-piece assault scheduled to begin on March 24th. Montgomery had assembled 25 divisions, 37,000 vehicles, and enough supplies to sustain what he promised would be the war's final great triumph. He had even brought Churchill to observe, confident that British military precision would deliver the knockout blow. The preparations were so elaborate that one American officer quipped, "If Monty crosses the Rhine, he'll do it with such ceremony that the Germans will have time to send engraved invitations to their own defeat." But 200 miles south, George S. Patton was thinking differently. Patton's Third Army had been racing across France and Germany with a speed that defied military logic. Since breaking out of Normandy the previous summer, his forces had moved with relentless momentum, consuming ground and enemy formations with equal appetite. His corps commanders, men like John Milliken and Manton Eddy, had learned to think like their general. Fast, aggressive, always moving forward. Patton's philosophy was simple. War was won by movement and violence of action. While other commanders studied maps and calculated logistics, Patton studied his enemy's weaknesses and exploited them before they could be reinforced. He had once said, "A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week." By March 1945, his entire army operated on this principle. On March 21st, as his forces approached the Rhine near the town of Oppenheim, Patton saw his opportunity. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, brought him the reconnaissance reports. The West Bank was lightly defended. Bridge demolitions had created gaps in German defensive positions. The town of Oppenheim itself held minimal garrison strength, perhaps 200 infantry, no armor, no heavy weapons. The Wehrmacht was stretched thin, expecting any major Allied crossing to come further north where Montgomery's preparations were impossible to conceal. Patton didn't hesitate. "Get me Eddy," he told his staff. Major General Manton Eddy, commanding the 12 Corps, received the call at 10:47 p.m. on March 21st. Patton's voice crackled through the field telephone, urgent and electric. "Manton, you're going across tonight. No delays, no elaborate preparations. Use whatever boats you have. I want a regiment on the east bank by dawn." Eddie, a cerebral officer who balanced Patton's aggression with careful planning, understood immediately. They had assault boats from the engineers, canvas and plywood craft designed for exactly this purpose. The 5th Infantry Division was closest to Oppenheim. They could lead the assault. "We have the boats," Eddie replied. "The 5th can move within the hour." "Then get them moving," Patton snapped. "And Eddie, not a word to chafe. We're crossing first, explaining later." This was vintage Patton, operating on the edge of insubordination, driven by an almost supernatural competitive instinct. His chief of staff, Hobart Gay, later wrote in his diary about that night, "The general paced like a caged tiger. He kept saying, 'Montgomery wants the glory. He wants to be the first across.' Well, we'll see about that." The rivalry between Patton and Montgomery had simmered throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe. Montgomery, the careful strategist who had beaten Rommel in North Africa. Patton, the aggressive cavalryman who believed wars were won by speed and shock. Both were brilliant. Both were insufferable. Both were absolutely convinced their way of war was superior. Now, with the Rhine before them, Patton was determined to prove his point. The 5th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Stafford Leroy Irwin, began moving toward Oppenheim at midnight. The soldiers, many of them combat veterans since Normandy, knew something unusual was happening. There was an urgency in the orders, a secrecy in the preparation that marked this as different from routine operations. Sergeant Warren Emmas of the 11th Infantry Regiment later recalled, "We got the word around Euro 100 hours. Light march, assault boats, move quiet." The officers looked excited, but also nervous. Nobody said it out loud, but we knew. We were going for the Rhine. The approach march was conducted in near total darkness. Patton had ordered minimal vehicle movement to avoid alerting German reconnaissance. The infantry moved on foot, carrying their assault boats, unwieldy canvas and plywood craft that weighed 450 pounds each, 12 men to a boat, plus the engineer who would guide them across. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ewell, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 11th Infantry, later described the scene. "The men were exhausted before we even reached the river, carrying those boats through the darkness, trying to stay quiet, knowing what was ahead. But there was this electricity in the air. Everyone knew we were about to do something historic." As the infantry approached the Rhine's western bank, officers whispered final instructions. No talking, no smoking, no unnecessary noise. The Germans on the far shore were close enough to hear a cough, close enough to turn this crossing into a slaughter if they were alerted. Back at 3rd Army headquarters in Eider-Oberstein, Patton monitored the situation with barely contained excitement. His aide, Colonel Charles Codman, noted the general's behavior that night. He was smoking incessantly, usually a sign of stress, but he was also smiling. Every time a radio report came through, he leaned in close, listening intently. Patton understood what was at stake. If the crossing succeeded, he would achieve what military planners said was impossible. He would beat Montgomery across the Rhine. He would prove that audacity and speed could accomplish what months of preparation promised to deliver. If it failed, if German defenders discovered the assault and opened fire on those canvas boats in mid-river, the casualties would be catastrophic. And Patton would face questions about why he had ordered an unauthorized operation that cost American lives. But failure wasn't something George S. Patton allowed himself to contemplate. At his headquarters, he poured himself a drink and stared at the map one more time. Somewhere in the darkness, his soldiers were moving toward the river. In a few hours, he would know if his gamble had succeeded. "Montgomery is still filling sandbags," he said to no one in particular, "and we're already going for Germany's throat." At 10:30 p.m. on March 22, 1945, the first assault wave hit the water. The Rhine at Oppenheim was approximately 1,000 feet wide, flowing at nearly 4 knots. The night was dark, a new moon providing minimal illumination. This was both blessing and curse. Darkness concealed the Americans from German observation posts, but it also made navigation treacherous. The engineers had marked the crossing points with subdued lights on the western bank, dim enough to avoid detection, but bright enough to guide the assault boats to their launch positions. The eastern bank was pure guesswork, a dark line across black water that the oarsmen would have to find by instinct and determination. Private First Class Donald Jones was in the third boat of the first wave. In a 1983 interview, he remembered every detail of those 11 minutes. The boat was packed, 12 of us plus the engineer driving. The water was freezing. Every time we hit a wave, spray came over the side. I remember thinking, if the Germans open up now, we're all dead. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Just that canvas boat and cold water and darkness. Jones gripped his rifle, useless in the boat, but providing some psychological comfort. Around him, other soldiers sat rigid, trying to keep their weight balanced as the boat bucked and swayed in the current. Our guy kept us pointed at that dark shore, Jones continued. The current wanted to take us downstream, but he kept compensating, kept us on course. I don't know how he did it in the dark. Maybe he could see better than us. Maybe he was just guessing. But he got us across. The crossing took 11 minutes, an eternity under the threat of enemy fire. Each man in that boat lived multiple lifetimes in those 11 minutes, imagining machine guns opening up, imagining the boat splintering under impact, imagining cold water rushing in. But, miraculously, the first boats landed unopposed. The German defenders, undermanned and demoralized after months of retreat, had not expected an assault at this location. Their attention was focused on Montgomery's obvious preparations to the north. Reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the massive buildup, the accumulation of bridging equipment, the concentration of forces that could only mean one thing. No one was watching Oppenheim. Lieutenant Donald Critchfield, leading the 2nd Platoon of Company E, later described the moment his boat scraped against the eastern bank. We hit the beach. It was really just a muddy slope, and fanned out. Still no contact. I remember thinking, where are they? We moved inland about 50 yards, weapons ready, expecting fire any second. Then we heard German voices about 200 yards inland. But they weren't alarmed. They were just talking, maybe smoking. They had no idea we were there. By 11:15 p.m., 2 companies of the 11th Infantry Regiment were ashore, nearly 250 men. They moved quickly, establishing a defensive perimeter, waiting for the inevitable German response. Behind them, more boats were already crossing, a steady stream of canvas craft ferrying the assault battalions across Hitler's impregnable river. The initial bridgehead was secured with minimal resistance. A few scattered shots from surprised German sentries, a brief exchange of fire as American soldiers overran a forward observation post, but no coordinated defense, no artillery barrage, no counterattack. By midnight, 8 companies were across, nearly 1,200 men establishing positions on the eastern bank. The Germans, when they finally realized what was happening, responded with scattered artillery fire. Shells burst along the riverbank, throwing up geysers of water and mud. But it was too late. The Americans were already digging in, already expanding the bridgehead. Back at 3rd Army headquarters, Patton monitored radio reports with barely contained excitement. His aide, Colonel Charles Codman, watched the general pace the operations room, smoking one cigarette after another. The general was in constant motion, Codman later wrote, listening to reports, issuing orders, checking the map, but he was also smiling. I'd never seen him smile like that during an operation. When the report came through that the 1st Battalions were across without major casualties, Patton actually laughed out loud, a deep, satisfied laugh that filled the room. Then he said something Codman never forgot. Montgomery is still filling sandbags, and we're already in Germany's bedroom. By dawn on March 23rd, the 5th Infantry Division had 4,000 men across the Rhine. Engineers were already ferrying tanks and artillery using improvised rafts and captured barges. What had begun as a covert assault crossing was rapidly becoming a major bridgehead. German counterattacks, when they finally came, were disorganized and ineffective. The Wehrmacht units in the sector had been stripped of their best troops, sent north to face Montgomery's expected assault. What remained were undermanned companies of exhausted infantry, backed by a handful of artillery pieces and no armor. Lieutenant Colonel Ewell's battalion repelled 3 separate counterattacks in the first 6 hours. Each time, German infantry advanced with more desperation than coordination, and each time, American firepower cut them down before they could reach the river. They kept coming, Ewell later wrote, but their hearts weren't in it. You could see it in the way they moved, the way they attacked. These weren't the SS fanatics we'd faced in Normandy. These were beaten men going through the motions because someone ordered them to. At 7:30 a.m., Patton finally called Supreme Headquarters. The conversation with General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, became legendary in American military circles. Bradley's operations officer answered first, and Patton's voice came through, crisp and gleeful. "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across. We knocked down 33 Krauts today when they came after us. I want the world to know 3rd Army made it before Monty starts across." When Bradley came on the line, Patton was even more exuberant. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley, confused, asked, "Across what?" "The Rhine, Brad. I sneaked a division over last night, but there are so few Krauts around, they don't know it yet. So don't make any announcement. We'll keep it a secret until we see how it goes." Bradley later wrote in his memoir about that conversation. "I was dumbfounded. George had crossed the Rhine with less preparation than we'd put into crossing the Seine, and he wanted to keep it quiet. That's when I realized this was as much about beating Montgomery as defeating Germans." But word spread quickly. By mid-morning, Eisenhower knew. His reaction was measured, publicly supportive, privately irritated by Patton's cowboy theatrics. His naval aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded in his diary, "Ike received the news with mixed feelings. He was pleased the crossing succeeded, but annoyed that Patton went ahead without clearance. He said, 'George couldn't have done this 6 months ago, but now with the Germans crumbling, he's made it look easy.'" The real test of reactions was yet to come, from Churchill and Montgomery. By the afternoon of March 23rd, Patton's bridgehead had become undeniable. 4,000 men had crossed in the first 12 hours. Engineers were working around the clock, ferrying tanks and artillery across on improvised rafts and captured German barges. The bridgehead was expanding rapidly, pushing inland against disorganized German resistance. What had begun as a covert assault was now a full-scale breach of Germany's last defensive line. German counterattacks continued, but they were poorly coordinated and easily repulsed. American casualties remained remarkably light, fewer than 50 men in the initial crossing and subsequent defense. The Wehrmacht units in the sector were simply too weak, too demoralized, too focused on Montgomery's impending assault to mount effective resistance. At 3rd Army headquarters, Patton was already planning the exploitation. Within 48 hours, he intended to have 30,000 men across. Within a week, he would be racing toward Frankfurt, cutting off German forces in the Ruhr, driving deep into the heart of the Reich. But first, he needed the world to know what he had accomplished. At 7:30 a.m. on March 23rd, Patton placed the call that would make history. The conversation with General Omar Bradley became the stuff of legend, repeated in officers' messes and military academies for decades afterward. Bradley's operations officer answered first, and Patton's voice came through the field telephone with unmistakable glee. "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across. We knocked down 33 Krauts today when they came after us. I want the world to know 3rd Army made it before Monty starts across." The operations officer, momentarily confused, summoned Bradley to the phone. When Bradley picked up, Patton was barely containing his excitement. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley, exhausted from managing the complexities of coordinating multiple army groups, didn't immediately comprehend what Patton was saying. "Across what?" There was a pause, then Patton's voice, savoring every word. "The Rhine, Brad. I sneaked a division over last night, but there are so few Krauts around, they don't know it yet. So don't make any announcement. We'll keep it a secret until we see how it goes." Bradley stood there, telephone in hand, trying to process what he'd just heard. George Patton had crossed the Rhine, without approval, without coordination, without even mentioning his intentions beforehand. He had simply identified an opportunity and exploited it with the kind of audacity that made him simultaneously invaluable and infuriating. Bradley later wrote in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, about that moment. I was dumbfounded. George had crossed the Rhine with less preparation than we'd put into crossing the Seine, and he wanted to keep it quiet until he was sure it would hold. That's when I realized this was as much about beating Montgomery as defeating Germans. But keeping it quiet was impossible. Word spread through Allied headquarters with the speed of wildfire. Staff officers whispered about it in corridors. Signals personnel passed the news along communication lines. Journalists, always alert for dramatic stories, began making inquiries. By mid-morning, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force knew. Eisenhower's reaction was characteristically measured, publicly supportive, privately irritated by Patton's disregard for proper command protocol. Captain Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's naval aide, recorded the Supreme Commander's response in his diary. Ike received the news with mixed feelings. He was pleased the crossing succeeded, but annoyed that Patton went ahead without clearance. He said, George couldn't have done this 6 months ago, but now with the Germans crumbling, he's made it look easy. Eisenhower understood Patton's genius and his limitations. The man could read a battlefield like few others, could exploit enemy weakness with surgical precision, could inspire soldiers to achieve what seemed impossible. But he was also politically tone-deaf, insubordinate when it suited him, and driven by personal ambitions that sometimes clouded his judgment. Still, Eisenhower couldn't argue with results. Patton had crossed the Rhine. American forces were on the eastern bank, expanding their bridgehead with minimal casualties. From a purely military standpoint, it was a triumph. But the real test of reactions came from across the Channel, from Churchill and Montgomery. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery learned of Patton's crossing at 11:12 a.m. on March 23rd, just 13 hours before his own Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin. His Chief of Staff, Major General Francis de Guingand, brought him the intelligence report, delivered by a signals officer who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Montgomery read the message in silence. His face, normally composed, hardened into something resembling granite. He read it a second time, as if hoping the words would change. Then he passed it to de Guingand without comment. De Guingand, who had worked with Montgomery long enough to read his moods, waited for the explosion that never came. Instead, Montgomery's voice was ice. I see. Patton has bounced the Rhine. How very American. He stood and walked to the map table, studying the disposition of forces. His operation, months in planning, involving 25 divisions and overwhelming firepower, was designed to be the decisive blow. Now, hours before it began, an American general with canvas boats and sheer audacity had stolen the thunder. We shall proceed with our operation as planned, Montgomery continued, his voice controlled. We shall demonstrate the difference between a river crossing and a proper military operation. It was a masterclass in British understatement, but everyone in the room understood what Montgomery was really saying. Patton's crossing might be dramatic, might capture headlines, but it lacked the systematic thoroughness that characterized professional military operations. Montgomery's crossing would be different, overwhelming, methodical, and comprehensive. Operation Plunder began at midnight on March 23rd to 24th with a 4-hour artillery barrage involving 3,500 guns. The bombardment was the largest since El Alamein, a rolling thunder that shook the earth and announced British intentions with unmistakable clarity. When the assault boats finally hit the water, they did so behind a curtain of fire so intense that German defenders could barely raise their heads. The assault was methodical, overwhelming, and successful. By dawn, Montgomery's forces had established multiple bridgeheads along a broad front. Casualties, despite the scale of the operation, were kept remarkably low through the sheer weight of supporting firepower. By any military metric, it was a textbook success, but it lacked the one thing Patton had achieved: surprise and speed. Where Patton had crossed in darkness with minimal preparation, Montgomery crossed with maximum visibility and overwhelming force. Where Patton had exploited enemy weakness, Montgomery had simply crushed enemy resistance through superior firepower. Both approaches worked, but they represented fundamentally different philosophies of warfare. Winston Churchill, meanwhile, was with Montgomery when the news of Patton's crossing arrived. He had traveled to Montgomery's headquarters specifically to witness what was supposed to be Britain's crowning achievement in the European War. When an aide handed Montgomery the message about Patton's crossing, Churchill was having breakfast in Montgomery's command caravan. The moment that followed would reveal everything about leadership, rivalry, and the brutal honesty required in coalition warfare. And what Churchill said next surprised everyone in the room. The command caravan was quiet, except for the murmur of staff officers coordinating the final preparations for Operation Plunder. Winston Churchill sat at the small table, spreading marmalade on toast, with the deliberate care of a man who had learned to find pleasure in small rituals during years of crisis. Around him, Montgomery's staff moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for what the field marshal had promised would be the war's decisive crossing. Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, sat across from Churchill, reviewing overnight intelligence reports. The atmosphere was one of controlled anticipation. In less than 12 hours, British forces would assault the Rhine in overwhelming strength. Then an aide entered, carrying a message flimsy. He approached Montgomery with visible hesitation, the kind of body language that suggested unwelcome news. Montgomery took the paper, read it, and his face hardened into an expression Brooke had seen before, the mask Montgomery wore when deeply displeased but determined not to show it. Without a word, Montgomery passed the message to Churchill. Churchill set down his toast. His reading glasses sat perched on his broad nose as he scanned the typed lines. Third Army crossed Rhine at Oppenheim, 22:30 hours, 22nd March. Bridgehead secured, minimal casualties. For a long moment, Churchill said nothing. The tension in the caravan became palpable. Everyone present understood what this meant. Patton had crossed first. The American general, with his pearl-handled pistols and insufferable confidence, had beaten Montgomery to the prize. Brooke later recorded in his diary what happened next, and his account captures a moment that revealed Churchill's greatness as a leader. Churchill read the message twice. Then he set it down carefully beside his plate. The silence stretched. Montgomery stood rigid, waiting for Churchill's response. The staff officers had stopped moving, everyone watching the Prime Minister. Then Churchill spoke, and his words were not what anyone expected. "Brilliant!" The word hung in the air. Churchill repeated it, louder this time, his voice filling with genuine admiration. "Absolutely brilliant! That magnificent American cowboy has done it again." Montgomery stiffened visibly. His voice, when he spoke, was carefully controlled. "Prime Minister, the operation was unauthorized and tactically unnecessary. We have—" Churchill cut him off with a wave of his hand, a gesture so decisive that Montgomery fell silent mid-sentence. "Bernard, I know what we have. We have the most meticulously planned operation of the war. We have overwhelming force. We have guaranteed success." He paused, picking up the message again, studying it as if seeing something others had missed. "But what Patton has done, crossing the Rhine with assault boats and sheer audacity, this is the kind of warfare that wins wars quickly." He set the paper down and looked directly at Montgomery. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "And it rather makes our preparations look a bit elaborate, doesn't it?" The comment landed like a physical blow. John Colville, Churchill's private secretary, who was present that morning, later wrote that Montgomery looked as if he'd been slapped. The field marshal's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. What could he say? Churchill had just praised the American general who had upstaged Britain's most carefully planned operation. But Churchill wasn't finished. He turned to Brooke, and what he said next revealed the strategic mind that had guided Britain through its darkest years. "The Americans have given us a gift, Alan. Patton's crossing will draw German reserves south, away from Bernard's operation. Hitler will panic when he learns the Rhine has been breached at 2 points. This couldn't have worked out better if we'd planned it." It was vintage Churchill, taking a potential embarrassment and reframing it as a strategic advantage. Patton's unauthorized crossing wasn't a problem, it was an opportunity. German forces would have to divide their attention, respond to threats from multiple directions, spread their already thin reserves even thinner. Montgomery, to his credit, recognized the wisdom in Churchill's assessment. He nodded slowly. "That is one way to view it, Prime Minister?" "It's the correct way to view it," Churchill replied firmly. "We proceed as planned, with the knowledge that the enemy is now facing a crisis on multiple fronts." Later that day, after Operation Plunder had begun with its massive artillery barrage, Churchill sent a cable to Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden back in London. The message, preserved in diplomatic archives, shows Churchill's private thoughts stripped of the diplomatic nicety he'd shown Montgomery. "Patton has bounced the Rhine with typical American flair. While I believe Monty's operation will be more consequential in its strategic impact, we must acknowledge that speed and audacity still have their place in modern warfare. The Americans have reminded us that wars are won not just by careful planning, but by the will to take calculated risks." It was as close as Churchill would come to admitting that British military doctrine had perhaps grown too cautious, too dependent on overwhelming preparation. The Great War had taught Britain to fear casualties, to value methodical approaches over risky gambles. Patton represented something different, a return to an older style of warfare where movement and shock still mattered. Churchill's public statement, released to the press on March 25th, was even more generous. "The crossing of the Rhine by American and British forces marks the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. General Patton's swift assault at Oppenheim and Field Marshal Montgomery's powerful operation in the north demonstrate the versatility and overwhelming strength of Allied arms. The enemy has nowhere left to hide." The statement was carefully crafted to give equal credit to both crossings, but those who knew Churchill understood what he was really saying. Patton's crossing wasn't just militarily successful, it was inspirational. It showed that even in 1945, with modern warfare's emphasis on firepower and logistics, individual audacity could still achieve decisive results. But the question that fascinated historians for decades was simpler and more personal. What did Churchill say directly to Patton himself? The answer to that question would come 3 days later, when Churchill visited Patton's bridgehead and walked across a pontoon bridge onto German soil. The meeting between these two men, the aging British statesman and the aggressive American general, would produce a moment of mutual recognition that transcended national rivalries. What Churchill said to Patton on the eastern bank of the Rhine, standing on conquered German territory, would reveal more about both men than any official statement or diplomatic cable ever could. And it would show why, despite all their differences, Churchill recognized in Patton something he valued above almost everything else: the warrior spirit that refuses to accept impossibility. March 26, 1945, 4 days after Patton's crossing. Winston Churchill arrived at Third Army headquarters with the weight of history on his shoulders. At 70 years old, exhausted by nearly 6 years of war, he had come to see for himself what Patton had accomplished, and more than that, to cross the Rhine himself, to set foot on German soil as a conquering leader. Patton, never one to miss an opportunity for theater, had prepared something special. He arranged for Churchill to walk across a newly constructed pontoon bridge spanning the Rhine at Oppenheim. It was a symbolic gesture, but one that carried profound meaning. This bridge, built by American engineers in just 3 days, represented everything Patton's crossing had achieved: speed, improvisation, and the transformation of an impossible obstacle into a highway for Allied armies. The scene was captured by Army photographers. The images show Churchill in his familiar overcoat, a cigar in hand, walking alongside Patton, who wore his full-dress uniform complete with the ivory-handled pistols that had become his trademark. Behind them, soldiers lined the pontoon bridge, standing at attention as the Prime Minister passed. The bridge swayed slightly with each step, the pontoons shifting in the current. Churchill moved carefully, one hand occasionally reaching for the guide rope. Patton walked beside him, pointing out features of the bridgehead, explaining how his engineers had constructed the crossing under sporadic German artillery fire. As they reached the eastern bank, German territory, Churchill stopped. He turned slowly, looking back across the Rhine at the western bank, then forward into Germany. The moment stretched. Photographers captured his expression, solemn, reflective, perhaps thinking of all the years that had led to this point. Then he turned to Patton. Charles Codman, Patton's aide, stood close enough to hear the exchange. He recorded it in his diary that evening, and his account has become one of the most quoted moments of the war's final months. Churchill's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of profound emotion. "General Patton, I have crossed many rivers in my life. I crossed the Nile as a young officer. I observed the Marne during the Great War." He paused, his gaze sweeping the landscape of a Germany that had terrorized Europe for 6 years. But this crossing, Hitler's Rhine, stepping onto German soil with the Wehrmacht in retreat, this is a moment I shall remember when all other memories have faded. Patton, typically ready with a quip or boast, was momentarily speechless. Those who knew him recognized this as rare. Patton lived for bold statements and dramatic gestures, but something in Churchill's words had reached him. When he finally replied, his voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its typical bravado. "Prime Minister, this river was supposed to stop us. Hitler said it was impossible. The German General Staff believed it would take months to breach." Then Patton's natural confidence reasserted itself, and he gestured toward the bridge behind them, toward the tanks and trucks streaming across. "But Third Army crossed it in one night with canvas boats and determined men. That's what happens when you tell Americans something is impossible. They do it before breakfast." Churchill smiled, a genuine, warm smile captured in the photographs. It was the smile of one warrior recognizing another, across differences of age and nationality and temperament. "Quite right, General. Quite right. Never tell an American something cannot be done. They take it as a personal challenge." The two men stood together on the eastern bank for several minutes, watching the flow of men and materiel across the pontoon bridge. Churchill asked questions about the crossing itself, about casualties, about German resistance. Patton answered with uncharacteristic modesty, crediting his officers and soldiers while downplaying his own role. But it was what happened afterward, in private, that revealed Churchill's true assessment of what he had witnessed. Later that afternoon, alone with his military secretary, General Hastings Ismay, Churchill reflected on the meeting. Ismay recorded the conversation in his post-war memoirs, and his account provides insight into Churchill's complex feelings about Patton and what the Rhine crossing represented. "Ismay, that man Patton is insufferable, arrogant, insubordinate, politically tone-deaf." Churchill paused, lighting a fresh cigar. Then he continued, and his voice carried a note of genuine admiration. "But my God, he can fight!" He moved to the window, looking out toward the Rhine, visible in the distance. When history is written, they'll remember that the Rhine, Hitler's Great Barrier, the river that was supposed to buy Germany months of defense, fell not to massive bombardments and elaborate plans, but to a general who simply decided it was time to cross, and then did it. Ismay waited, knowing Churchill had more to say. "There's a lesson in that for all of us who have grown too cautious in our old age. We've learned to minimize risk, to rely on overwhelming force, to plan everything down to the last detail. These are good instincts, born of bitter experience. But Patton reminds us that sometimes the moment demands boldness over caution, speed over preparation." Churchill turned back to Ismay, his expression thoughtful. "The Americans have something we've lost, Hastings. They still believe impossible is just another word for difficult. They haven't yet learned to be afraid of their own ambitions." It was a remarkable admission from a man who had built his career on bold rhetoric and aggressive action. Churchill had led Britain through its finest hour, had refused to surrender when defeat seemed certain, had inspired a nation to fight on alone against Nazi tyranny. Yet he recognized that something had changed in British military culture, a shift toward caution, born of the Great War's horrific casualties. The relationship between Churchill and Patton remained cordial but complex in the weeks that followed. Churchill admired Patton's fighting spirit while remaining wary of his political naivete and tendency toward controversial statements. In a letter to Eisenhower written in April 1945, Churchill offered this assessment: General Patton is unquestionably a superb battlefield commander. I would trust him to execute any tactical operation with skill and determination. However, he requires careful handling off the battlefield, where his judgment is less reliable. It was a fair evaluation. Patton's genius was military, not political. He understood combat with an almost supernatural instinct, but struggled with the diplomatic complexities of coalition warfare. Yet when Patton died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a car accident, Churchill's response revealed the depth of his respect for the American general. He sent a personal message to Patton's widow, Beatrice, that cut through diplomatic formality to express genuine grief. Your husband was a warrior in the truest sense, bold, decisive, and utterly committed to victory. His crossing of the Rhine will be remembered as long as men study warfare. Britain has lost a great friend and ally. The free world has lost a champion. Before we close, let's reflect on what this moment truly meant. The contrast between Montgomery's crossing and Patton's could not have been more stark. Montgomery's Operation Plunder involved 80,000 troops in the initial assault, supported by 1,000 artillery pieces and 1,500 aircraft. It was a masterpiece of planning and execution, with casualties kept remarkably low through overwhelming firepower. By any military metric, it was a textbook success. Patton's crossing involved 4,000 troops in the first 12 hours, supported by whatever artillery could be quickly moved forward. It succeeded through speed, surprise, and the exploitation of enemy weakness. Casualties in the initial crossing were fewer than 50 men, a remarkably low figure that shocked military analysts on both sides. The German reaction revealed which crossing they feared more. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations staff, was interrogated after the war about the Rhine crossings. His testimony, preserved in U.S. Army archives, is illuminating. When Montgomery crossed, we were prepared. We knew it was coming. We had positioned reserves and planned counterattacks. The operation was massive, but it held no surprises. Jodl paused, then continued with evident frustration. When Patton crossed at Oppenheim, this was a shock. We had minimal forces there because we never believed anyone would attempt a major crossing without extensive preparation. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. The Americans were across in strength, and our ability to mount a coordinated defense was already compromised. Hitler's own reaction, recorded by his secretary Traudl Junge in her memoir, was apoplectic. The Führer was beside himself. He demanded to know how Patton had crossed so quickly. He accused his generals of incompetence, of treason. He kept saying, "One American general with boats made of canvas has achieved what Eisenhower said would take weeks," Junge continued, describing Hitler's obsession with Patton in those final weeks. The general staff tried to assure him that Montgomery's crossing was the main threat, but Hitler was fixated on Patton. He said, "That man is a demon. He doesn't fight like a soldier. He fights like a Hun." The strategic consequences were immediate and devastating for Germany. Patton's bridgehead expanded rapidly. Within 48 hours, he had 30,000 men across. Within a week, he was racing toward Frankfurt, encircling the Ruhr, cutting off German Army Group B. Montgomery's forces, crossing on a broader front, linked up with Patton's Third Army by March 28th, creating an unstoppable Allied advance into the heart of Germany. But beyond the tactical success, Patton's Rhine crossing represented something deeper, a vindication of aggressive mobile warfare in an age increasingly dominated by set-piece battles and overwhelming firepower. The U.S. Army's official history, written by Charles B. MacDonald, concluded, Patton's assault crossing of the Rhine at Oppenheim stands as one of the finest examples of opportunistic warfare in modern military history. With minimal preparation and maximum audacity, Third Army achieved what pessimists said was impossible and what planners said would require weeks of preparation. The human dimension of the crossing is equally remarkable. The soldiers who crossed that night, young men in canvas boats paddling through icy water into enemy territory, displayed extraordinary courage. Sergeant Warren Emmes, who crossed in the first wave, later reflected in an interview, "People ask me what I was thinking. Honestly, I was thinking, don't let the boat tip, don't fall in the water, keep paddling." It wasn't heroic thoughts, it was survival. But looking back, I realized we were part of something historic. We were the guys who broke Hitler's last line. Private Donald Jones added his own perspective years later. "I told my grandson about crossing the Rhine. He asked if I was scared. I said terrified. He asked why I did it. I told him, because my lieutenant got in the boat first, because the guy next to me was paddling, because quitting wasn't an option." That's what it came down to. Not grand strategy, but not wanting to let down the men beside you. The crossing also revealed the importance of junior leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ewell, whose battalion secured the initial bridgehead, later wrote, "General Patton gave the order, but we executed it. He trusted us to figure out the details, how to get the boats to the river, how to organize the assault waves, how to establish the perimeter. That trust made all the difference. We weren't just following orders, we were empowered to think and adapt." Churchill's continued fascination with Patton was evident in the weeks that followed. On March 30th, as Allied forces raced across Germany, Churchill wrote to Roosevelt, "The American army under Patton has performed magnificently. While I remain convinced that Montgomery's systematic approach serves important strategic purposes, I must acknowledge that Patton's ruthless exploitation of enemy weakness has shortened this war. The Germans fear him more than any other Allied commander, and fear is a powerful weapon." This admission was significant. Churchill, a loyal champion of British commanders, was acknowledging American military excellence, specifically the effectiveness of a general whose style was antithetical to British military tradition. In private conversations with his staff, Churchill was even more effusive. John Colville recorded Churchill saying, "Patton is what we would have called in my day a thruster. A commander who attacks not because the plan demands it, but because his instinct tells him the moment is right. We've become too scientific in our warfare, too dependent on perfect intelligence and overwhelming force. Patton reminds us that confusion, speed, and shock still have their place." Post-war military analysts spent years studying the operation. The U.S. Army War College published a comprehensive analysis in 1948 that concluded, "General Patton's Rhine crossing demonstrated that opportunistic warfare, when executed by competent forces under dynamic leadership, can achieve strategic results beyond those attainable through conventional methods." The operation should be studied not as an alternative to systematic planning, but as a complement to it, a reminder that flexibility and audacity must accompany even the most carefully laid plans. British military historian B.H. Liddell Hart, writing in 1950, placed Patton's crossing in historical context. "Since Napoleon's campaigns, military theorists have debated the relative merits of methodical versus opportunistic warfare. Patton's Rhine crossing proved both have their place. Montgomery's careful, overwhelming assault secured a broad front with minimal risk. Patton's swift, unexpected assault exploited enemy weakness and accelerated the campaign. Neither approach was universally superior. Success depended on matching method to circumstance." The final judgment on Patton's Rhine crossing comes from perhaps the most unlikely source, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery himself. In a private conversation with military historian Forrest Pogue in 1947, recorded in Pogue's research notes, Montgomery admitted something remarkable. "Patton's Rhine crossing was a stroke of genius. I would never have attempted it. Too risky, too hasty, too dependent on luck, but it worked brilliantly. That's the difference between Patton and me. I never took unnecessary risks. Patton never saw a risk as unnecessary if it promised victory. History will judge which approach was wiser, but I'll concede this. On March 22, 1945, Patton's way was exactly what the situation demanded. This may be the most honest assessment of all. Patton wasn't always right. His impulsiveness caused problems throughout his career. But at the Rhine in March 1945, facing a collapsing enemy and a fleeting opportunity, his instinct for aggressive action was precisely what the moment required. Churchill recognized this even as it highlighted the contrast with Britain's more methodical approach. The deeper meaning of Churchill's reaction lies in what it revealed about leadership and national character. Britain, exhausted by nearly 6 years of war, had become cautious, seeking to minimize casualties, avoid risks, preserve what remained of its strength. America, more recently engaged and more confident in its resources, still believed in bold action and decisive victory. Churchill, spanning both worlds, a Victorian warrior who had witnessed the horrors of modern industrial warfare, understood both approaches. His praise for Patton was genuine, but tinged with melancholy. He saw in Patton's crossing not just military success, but a passing of the torch. Britain's careful, systematic warfare had served its purpose, but the future belonged to those willing to take risks for quick victory. In his war memoirs, published in 1953, Churchill devoted several pages to Patton's Rhine crossing. He wrote, "Among the many remarkable feats of arms I witnessed during the Second World War, few impressed me more than General Patton's assault crossing of the Rhine. With minimal preparation and maximum audacity, he achieved what conventional military wisdom said was impossible. As I stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine on March 26, 1945, watching Patton's tanks roll into the German heartland, I knew that Nazi tyranny's days were numbered." In the end, what Churchill said when Patton crossed the Rhine mattered less than what he didn't say. He didn't claim credit for British planning. He didn't minimize the achievement. He didn't allow national pride to obscure military reality. Instead, he acknowledged excellence wherever he found it, even when it came from an ally whose methods differed from his own. This generosity of spirit, this ability to praise competitors and recognize merit regardless of source, was perhaps Churchill's greatest strength. It's why the Allied coalition held together despite friction between commanders. It's why British and American forces could work together despite different approaches. And it's why, when Patton crossed the Rhine, Churchill's response was not jealousy or dismissal, but genuine admiration. If you've made it this far, you're clearly a true history enthusiast. Please subscribe and hit that like button. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into history's most incredible moments. Share this video with anyone who loves untold military history. And remember, when they told Patton the Rhine was impassable, he didn't argue. He just proved them wrong before breakfast.